Welcome. This is the Insider's Edge to Real Estate Investing with James Nelson, the principal and head of Avis & Young's Tri-State Investment Sales Group. In this program, you'll learn game-changing strategies to outperform the market. James will teach you how to source, execute, and capitalize on the best real estate opportunities in New York and around the world. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to episode number 225 of the Insider's Edge to Real Estate Investing. This is your host, James Nelson. I'm principal and head of U.S. investment sales for Avis & Young. And with us today is Rob Dunn. We're going to be talking about revitalizing communities. And you're going to learn how affordable housing can create meaningful change in this episode. Rob is managing director at Fairstead, an institutional and community partner. The firm oversees a national portfolio with in-house expertise in acquisitions, development and construction, property management, and community impact. And you're going to gain insight today on how portfolio managers work with local governments, navigate compliance, financing challenges, and create improved environments for residents. Rob shares his journey from syndication to acquisitions to asset management and why mastering operations can give you the insider's edge. As always, you can go to jamesnelson.com. I built this site for you. That's where you can find the show notes. That's where you can find out how to connect with Rob. There's also a newsletter that you can sign up for and a lot of other helpful information. Also, stay tuned. I've been doing these Ask Me Anything webinars with Adventures in Commercial Real Estate. We're going to be announcing a partnership soon that we're super excited for, so keep an eye out. More to come in that space. So we're going to take a brief word from our sponsor and we'll get right into that interview with Rob Dunn.
A different approach to putting our clients first. Avis & Young's U.S. investment sales group oversees multifamily, office, retail development, and specialty sales across the country. We give you direct access to our 60 U.S. offices to source the best acquisition opportunities or to advise on dispositions. Our principally led teams leverage the best research and data analytics to provide you with tailor-made strategies to achieve superior results. Please visit avisandyoung.us/capital-markets or follow James Nelson NYC to learn more.
All right, good, wonderful. Thrilled to have with us today my friend Rob Dunn, who is managing director of Fairstead. Rob, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Good. So I know you spent time here in New York where we first met, but now you're now based out of Florida. But maybe just for our audience, give a little introduction on Fairstead.
Sure. So Fairstead's a national affordable housing developer. We own about 25,000 units in 28 states. Mm-hmm. So we are national. We follow the smile a little to a certain extent. Our main asset presence is in New York, and then secondarily Florida and Ohio, and we're increasing our asset counts in Texas. But we're throughout the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic and all the way over through California. So we're vertically integrated, developer, owner. We have a management company, construction company, and we're purchasing Section 8 and low-income housing tax credit investments, as well as we do own some market rate in New York City rent stabilized as well. So we're opportunistic, and but our bread and butter definitely is as an affordable housing developer. Great.
Yeah, it was interesting when I was doing just some research for the show and going to your website, Fairstead.com, the first thing that pops up is the impact report. It was really interesting to kind of look at, a lot of times when you go to an investor's website, it happens to do with kind of the, AUM, kind of the financial metrics, if you will. This had to do a lot more with the impact, how many people you are serving. So if I'm not mistaken, 40,000 residents plus that you've served. And, Fairstead also talks about the impact that you're making. One of the first things that popped up was health and wellness, education. So again, it sounds like kind of the foundation of what Fairstead was founded on is kind of this community impact. Is that a fair statement?
It's definitely a fair statement. Yeah, I mean, having a purpose-driven, social impact is our main priority. Everyone can read about the affordable housing crisis across the country, really. But it's not even just being an owner, and servicing those, but it's really improving those communities. And we're at the assets. We're interacting with the residents and the management the property managers. So we feel the impact, and we're out there, and so we're trying to take our assets, improve them, improve the quality of life for our residents. And, that's what we're out doing. So it definitely is at the forefront of our thinking.
In your role, so you are a portfolio manager. For those of you who don't understand kind of what that job entails, maybe tell the audience kind of what your mandate is.
Yeah. So, my team comprises, I think we have about 10 asset managers. So, we definitely have the traditional, maybe what people are more used to, just, an asset manager manages a property, right? And then you increase their property counts from 1 to 15 or 20. And you can almost call them a portfolio manager at that point, but really it is property level asset management. When you get more into the portfolio management, you're starting to think about your investors on the deals and your lenders and really being able to like put the whole picture together. So, we have, for Fairstead, we have different, different pieces of the pie in terms of which investors and lenders, hold certain portfolio purchases. And so in that respect, we're reporting on those as portfolios, right? The blocking and tackling is fairly similar. And, depending on, the vintage of the assets, the location, what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But, if the lender wants to know, how the trailing 12 financials are, obviously, that is a dedicated cluster. And then, we do have some older buildings that have been in the Fairstead legacy for a longer amount of time. And then we just have, different vintage investments that we've made. Fairstead is, 25,000 units. So it didn't happen overnight, but there was good scale quickly. And, through some of the bigger portfolio purchases that did help ramp up the portfolio and really, help the firm jump from a national investment level.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about portfolio management and there's, asset management overseeing the overall direction of the investment, many would think kind of property management, that's one component of it, obviously making sure that the properties run smoothly. But also, I would imagine with with affordable housing, rather, that how you end up financing these. And I would imagine that a lot of these are in partnership either with not-for-profits or public-private partnerships. So are you involved in that side of the business as well?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of our investing is public-private partnerships, right? It's like we go into the local communities. We are very focused on, understanding who the local players are, meeting with the people who are on the public side, because some of these assets are tougher than others, and they're on localities' radars and saying 123 Main Street's a problem. Well, we come in and say, let's talk about 123 Main Street. What's your point of view? Where are you seeing issues? We're in there on a day-to-day basis, running the asset, making sure that the residents are the ones that are supposed to be living there, and that if there's non-compliance, that we're addressing that, and that we're creating a community so that every resident is comfortable in their own home. To get there, it's easier said than done, but there could be a lot of nuances. We might have to occasionally be involved with the local authorities versus the local city and planning, so it definitely takes a little bit of an army to get some of the tougher properties up and running. And then, at the ones that we're in, where we're established and the properties are stabilized and running, we want to maintain good relationships. We host community events and really try to give back to the community, because in our experience, we've just felt that the more successful and community-based you can make, the more community-based you can make a property, the more successful it will be in the long run. So you want people to look just beyond their day-to-day living situation. It's really, we want these to be people's homes, even though they're renters.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know if Old Town, the Old Town Alexandria project is a good example, but that's, I believe, Fairstead's first ground up. It was a $120 million development that you did in partnership with Old Town Alexandria in Virginia. So how did that come about? How was it decided what was needed? And ultimately, what did you all build there?
Yeah, so we closed on that recently. So we haven't really started the work yet, but I will give total credit to our development team. This has been, I think, about 5 years in the making, so it didn't happen overnight. It's a very complicated structure. It's a blend of, it's like a tax credit hybrid deal, ground up. There's going to be some retail that serves the community. in terms of like a grocery store that, residents can come and get food as needed. But that's really been like a huge lift, and especially for Fairstead's first ground up, it didn't happen overnight. So, the heavy part is still to come, the actual construction part. But, talks about public-private partnership, like that's a prime example. So it took years to tee up, and now that we finally closed, we'll be able to start that development.
And then for existing, repositioning, renovations, any success stories, any projects where, you said you took over a property that, whether it was challenged, whether there's tenancy issues, or I would imagine a lot of these buildings that you come into have a tremendous amount of violations. Any success stories that you would point to of a project that you took over and have since improved?
Yeah. I think a lot of the improvement comes with the property improvement. So, again, I'll give full credit to our development team. But last year we purchased a property in Florida, outside of Fort Lauderdale, very rundown, very troubled, had to meet with the local authorities. And like just the public planning let us know how much of an issue the asset was. We went in, or our development team went in, did full building renovations. Like, this is a part of the job that I really do enjoy, is like getting to go see the before and after. So on the before side, you go in, there's shutters that kind of look like that radiate over there, over every window. There's no natural sunlight, just like the grounds are in disrepair. The facades are all falling off, like, did not look like a good place to live, right? Even walking through is not the best experience, but you see this is how people are living, and this is why we're here. So our development team, renovated every single building. They're still finishing up, I think, the last few apartments, but we came in, on time, on budget, and completely turned around the asset, where we have like letters coming in saying thank you guys for turning this property around. Like that's like a good success story. And that's like an ideal situation. Again, it wasn't easy, but the development team had a great execution, and now these folks who live at the asset have a better environment to live in, and better units to live in. So sometimes you go in to some Section 8 apartments, and they're borderline inhabitable. So to be able to make those like upgraded, new appliances, everything, upgraded, it truly is a turnaround for the community.
Yeah, as you're saying this, I'm wondering how it gets to that point, because I know if you take Section 8, for example, federal program, if I'm not mistaken, there's at least annual inspections that need to take place and to qualify and receive payments. So if the landlord is not keeping the property up to proper working order, I would imagine either there's penalties, they could be losing rent, maybe ultimately losing control of the property. So how do some of these situations get so bad? And ultimately, then how do you get the opportunity to go buy it? Is it a point where in some cases the city's actually taking back the property if it's bad enough, or maybe the operator just hasn't been doing the proper amount of work to keep it up, so they're being penalized, and so you say, look, it's probably just easier to sell. I'm sure you've dealt with several different kinds of these situations.
Yeah. In terms of how do they get there, look, every affordable housing owner, there's a lot of heavy compliance related, activities that they should be engaging in. And you have to, in order to get, the payments from the government, your files need to be updated every year, and you need to qualify your residents and make sure that qualify is the right word, qualify to live in those units. In terms of how the physical condition gets there, it's just that, people aren't going into the apartments every year. There's some residents who don't want to let people into their homes. You can get there, and then you just have some owners who, even if they get in there, they don't want to invest the money. They don't see a return on their investment. They don't see why they should be spending the money to make, to upgrade those units. And and then in the rare case, sometimes people do invest money into it, and then they over time come back to that original situation that it was in the first time that someone chose to invest capital there. So, and look, in terms of localities taking assets back, they don't want to, right? It's the same thing with banks. If a bank wants to take back an asset, it's usually there's some value driven motive there, right? Like the debt is still above what the asset's value, so there's a spread there, or they can maybe if they take it back, they have to own it, right? For us as a developer, our pitch is we're the experts. Why would you, city of, wherever, want to take this back? Because what are you going to do with it? Do you have the dedicated resources? Do you have the capital? Like, are you going to be able to turn this around? Usually the answer is no, right? You need someone with expertise who's gone in, who's, had their successes, made their mistakes, learned from investment practices with people who are skilled and this is their primary job. It's very difficult for, a locality to turn it around a different way. So that's why the partnership that we're trying to make with the public domains in various markets is super important, because we want them to think of us, and like the story I just gave you about the Florida asset, they even reach out and say, hey, there's another property over down the road. Do you guys want to take a look at that? So like we've seen that in multiple markets all across the country, where if you do a good job, the local presence wants you to try to get more involved in their communities.
Mm-hmm. So we've had some affordable developers on the show who've talked about, how they finance these developments, and many of these end up being tax credit deals as well. But it seems that the compensation. Why are these developers doing it beyond obviously doing good, but also how are they compensated? And that business is largely a fee-driven business, where it's kind of set fees on what the developer gets paid for actually their time and building the projects. Just for our audience who have not invested or thought about affordable housing before, just on a very basic level, how do you look at the numbers when you take that project that you're going to take over? It's going to require capital to come in and spend. How are you thinking about, first of all, capitalizing that deal? And then how are you ultimately going to make an economic return from doing that?
Yeah, I mean, when we go in, we look at what we need to do and what we want to do. And I think, one of our big initiatives is we like to put in a sizable check per door. It's when you look at the in-unit renovations, and then, the roofs and the facades and the grounds and other, maybe common area the common areas and some amenities you want to put in, that's how we capitalize the deals. And then you get your qualified basis and you get low-income housing tax credits off of that. And then you get your paid developer fee and deferred developer fee. Part of what our asset management team is focused on is, you get funds released, equity installments and developer fees once you stabilize the assets, or it goes through rental achievement, where it's basically once you hit your pro forma, more or less. So on the asset management side, we actually have a dedicated asset manager who works hand in hand with our developers. And then over time, as the developers go through, upgrade the property, and then we start the reletting process, that asset manager is looking at the numbers, looking at revenue, looking at the expenses, doing DSCR tests. So, because once the property hits, a stabilized basis and meets those DSCR requirements or the rental achievements, you can release funds, and that's where the return comes in. So, we are incentivized to do the full development life cycle, I'm not going to say as fast as possible, but in a timely manner. So, those locked up funds get released back to us as the developer.
Mm-hmm. So Fairstead, if I'm not mistaken, is a for-profit entity, but you all partner with not-for-profits sometimes as your operator. Can you kind of explain how that might work, kind of the relationship between the for-profit and not-for-profit operator?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example.
I was thinking one, I saw that Project Find was your senior housing operator on the Upper West Side project. But that.
Yeah. So that project was an old SRO that was converted into senior housing, and I believe it was the first, senior housing conversion of its kind in New York City. So again, this is. It's on Central Park West, in between Columbus and 79th Street. Prime location. Was a old hotel at some point, and we basically worked on the mission with Project Find. Us as Fairstead, we do operate and we're the property manager and we're very hands on. So I think it was kind of working with Project Find got us from the start to the finish, and so through the development phases and the funding, we highly relied on our relationship with them, and got it to a finish and finally got it, I think, fully occupied, within the last 6 months. So it was a long project, and it was a good lease up project. But yeah, we really rely on those partners, on the upfront and the development and the planning. So once the product's delivered, we can take over as the operator.
Mm-hmm. The idea of kind of affordable housing being owned, operated by a for-profit versus a not-for-profit versus owned by government, right? So any, kind of thoughts on the different approaches? And I would assume it's probably a good thing to have all different kinds of, parties involved, depending on what the project is.
I mean, yeah, obviously I'm going to be biased because I think that we're in the position as a, for-profit developer to create the best end product, which I think is what everyone wants. And, we're a stabilized organization. We have people with, tens of, it's probably hundreds of years of experience. You put it all together, but we have very experienced developers that came in. So some people come in through the private sector. Some people, we have people even on the asset management team who have been in government. And so we kind of put it all together from my point of view at our for-profit organization. And also we have the ability, government's very, I guess, challenging in terms of being flexible. Whereas, we understand the rule book, and the rule book gets updated every few months or every year, and we play by that book. So as a for-profit developer, we just think we're better positioned to, there's less red tape. We can go through, make changes in development if we have to. If we see obstacles or roadblocks, we can shift more easily. There's less bureaucracy. And it just allows us to, I think, kind of achieve a better end product than, maybe the other resources would have available to them. Got it.
So you're in 28 different states. Talk about the differences. I mean, some of these are federal programs, but sometimes, it's driven by the state. I'm sure as you go into some, cities, towns, municipalities, there might be, nuances. So, how do you go about, learning how to, well, I guess the first part of the question is the decision ultimately to expand into other markets, right? Because Fairstead, if I'm not mistaken, started here in New York and has since expanded. And so kind of what prompted that? And then as you do business in these different states, how do you get up to speed on the requirements and, even, finding opportunities in these new markets?
Yeah. I mean, New York's great, and there's a lot. There's a lot to do here, but it also has its geographical limitations, obviously, and therefore, it's tough to grow, just focusing on New York. So, we had made a decision, years ago that we started jumping into other states and continued. And, our management company, which now has over 22,000 units under management, they're in all the states, that we're in as ownership, and really getting boots on the ground is important to learning the different local markets. Because the way we're structured from a property management standpoint is you have your regional managers that go down the property level. So you have people who are getting more and more familiar with, the Mid-Atlantic or Florida or Texas, and they all definitely have their own nuances. I think, like anything, just experience kind of teaches you, and getting into these states and getting through issues and solving problems. So the first time you invest in Texas, you may encounter stuff you didn't expect, but you learn. And then on the second one, it's a little easier, and so on and so on. And I think, we've really, syncing up with our management company, we really do have local expertise and local boots on the ground. And I think that's super important in managing the different localities. But I've traveled, all across the country visiting our assets, and it is different in different states. It's much different in, Alabama versus Nevada. People's personalities are different, people's values are different, and you have to learn that and kind of, like I said, we've talked about before, right? It's all about public-private partnerships. So we come down there as kind of an outsider, but we get into the nitty-gritty with them, and we become local in our expertise for the properties that we own in those different markets. And I mean, that never stops, right? So, we're continuing to invest in the 28 states that we're in. We probably will invest in states that we're not in again, but we do have good knowledge and good experience in the states that we are in. So we kind of keep on, I will not like double down, but we keep on investing where the rules.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that when you're doing business in a new state, your track record and kind of leveraging that knowledge that's worked and saying, well, hey, this is how Alabama does it. This is how we've been able to be successful in Texas. And you can bring that to new states. So I'm sure that's helpful. And also, I mean, I noticed that you all have received some nice awards, one from Freddie Mac, one from NAHMA, an affordable housing organization. So, clearly you've done right by these projects. So I think maybe let's talk a little bit about finding the opportunities. So, and kind of what to look for. So it sounds like a lot of these times you're talking, to the, the city, the municipality, or is it, brokers who bring you these opportunities? Do you get involved yourself in these acquisitions? Yeah.
Non first and foremost, we do have our development team that sources acquisitions. Mm-hmm. They work with brokers plenty or localities like the public players, but the brokers are a big part of our business. Mm-hmm. We've had a lot of success. They know what's out there, and in terms of like the competitive advantage, we just know how we can operate in those states. We understand, the revenue streams. Depending on what type of option contract. If there's a HAP contract, what's on it. Like, we understand our levers and we understand.
Can you just explain for the audience what a HAP contract is?
Yeah, I mean, these assets are regulated, and you enter into HAP contracts whereby we're keeping the units at an affordability level that's dictated under the HAP contract, and we have to lease units to people at certain AMI with certain AMI restrictions. And, so again, when I was talking before about, recertifying tenants, we have to, every year you have to understand how much is the tenant or the resident making to remain in that units. And so
AMI, the annual median income, that changes every year. It's statewide, or is it citywide typically?
It depends, but usually, like in New York, it's by zip code, right? So it really depends. So that changes every year. People's jobs change every year, right? Like, you could have gotten a big promotion and then maybe you price yourself out of your unit, or maybe you lost your job. So you had half the income you did last year, which means you'll be paying, since you're paying 30% of your rent as a Section 8 tenant, if your income goes down, your monthly rent payment goes down. And if it goes up, your monthly rent payment goes up. So that's part of the compliance to make sure that we're housing the proper people that the government intended to be in those units.
I would imagine that would be challenging, though, if someone, if their income is volatile. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily having to move apartments every year. It's just what kind of subsidy is happening, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And it is very challenging. And, obviously, you run into residents who don't want to cooperate and they don't want to recertify, but that's why we have like a large compliance presence at our company that works, day in, day out with the property management company to make sure that, we are in full compliance, so we don't lose our subsidy as the owner of the property.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Rob, this has been super helpful to kind of understand, Fairstead's business and, again, how you're serving these communities. I think it'd be helpful also for our audience just to understand a little bit about your story, because we met originally your time at Hub NYC. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what you were doing for them. I know you've also been involved in not just asset management, but overseeing the property management, assisting with capital transactions, and then maybe even your time earlier at Long Wharf Capital or Meridian Investments. Maybe just talk about your background and how that's helped you in your position you are today. Yeah.
So my first job out out of college was with Meridian, as you mentioned, a different Meridian than New York, which was focused on raising private equity for affordable housing funds. So that's where I first got into real estate and affordable housing. And that was more on the syndication side. So you have groups that go out and aggregate a portfolio of affordable housing properties, and just like a fund, they need to raise money for it. So they go to different investors, mainly banks who are required to invest in their community, which is CRA, Community Reinvestment Act. So banks need to invest into the areas where there's lower affordability that they service. Otherwise, I believe, at least it was 20 years ago, it prevents the expansion of banks, and if they don't comply with it. So I did that for a couple of years and realized I wanted to learn more about the real estate finance component of it. At which point I went back to grad school and got my 2-year master's at Cornell in the real estate program there. And so I graduated there from 2010 and ended up back in Boston, where I'm originally from, at Long Wharf, which was Fidelity's private real estate arm, where I worked in asset management as an asset management associate, doing a lot of valuation work, learning how to interact with property management companies. So I happened to work a lot in multifamily when I was there. Did a little bit of retail, a little bit of hotels. And I worked there for a few years, and life brought me to New York, where I actually got a job working acquisitions at Hub NYC, which had a different name at the time, and worked in acquisitions for a few years, which where I was heavily involved, where we probably met, and with Massey Knackle guys, and we were mid-market institutional investor, just investing in retail at first, and then retail and multifamily in Manhattan, and then expanded out into the boroughs. Hub also kind of, ramped up quickly. And, as a value add investor, I think after a few years, it was like, okay, we own a lot of properties, our portfolio jumped, I think it was probably when I first joined, 30 assets, right? With a lot of value add strategies that had to be executed. So it's whether it's reletting retail vacancy or improving common areas, apartments, all that good stuff, was the focus for Hub. And then, the world New York City was really tight back in 2013, 14 in terms of cap rates, people were looking at 4 caps and stuff like that. And us as a buyer, a long-term buyer, kind of put the brakes, said, okay, let's just take this time and go back and do, our real investment, back into the properties, with a lot of the construction kept going, and we started to pull on those levers. So at that point, I moved from acquisitions back to asset management, where, I spent for, 5 years, right, after being in acquisitions for 3 years. So that kind of refocused me on my asset management career. But, getting those few years in the acquisition world was super valuable. I met a ton of people, including yourself and some people you still work with today. And, it really expanded my network of, investment sales brokers, retail leasing brokers, and really kind of solidified my New York City network for that time period. And then, like I said, I worked there for about 8 years, and, just New York, again, love investing in New York. It's a good place to park your money, but it is very, very challenging. And at the time, with cap rates so low and just the compliance requirements escalating and taxes were kind of getting out of control, I was like, I think I want to try my hand at looking for a more national company. And then I connected with Fairstead, and that's where we are today.
Great. So you were a poli-sci major at Colgate, where our audience knows that I'm a proud graduate as well. I think we've now had at least 3 other guests from Colgate. So Dan Hurwitz, Chad Cooley, and Thomas Campbell. And for those of you who are interested in the affordable space, definitely go back and listen to that episode with Thomas Campbell as well. But did you know, coming out of a liberal arts education, that you wanted to go into real estate? I mean, that position at Meridian, which was, on the affordable, interfacing with private equity, is that even something that you had thought about doing, or how did you even know about that coming out of a liberal arts education?
I didn't. I knew I wanted to do something kind of on the finance side, but real estate wasn't exactly on my purview. But I actually found, it was through a Colgate, the Colgate Alumni Network, that I found a job, outside of Boston, and I went in and met with them, and it seemed like, a good fit at the time, and a good entry point into the finance world. So yeah, I had no idea. I have a couple family members. My dad, my brother. Who my dad had ended up in real estate, working with raising capital for a company that invested in REITs. So that was a little bit of exposure there, and then my brother just happened to get in real estate. It's kind of yeah, you know what, I could do real estate, and so it was it wasn't my dream since I was 7, but but I think it worked out in the long run.
Got it. And for our listeners, maybe they're in school now. I mean, so sometimes the track is starting off as an analyst and then maybe going to the acquisitions role. I mean, since you've done acquisitions and you've done asset management ultimately where you've landed, and now even, as a portfolio manager, kind of, advice you would have for someone thinking about where they should land? Because I would imagine, I'm sure having done both, there's a lot of, you said you learned a lot from both perspectives, but I would also imagine that there's probably a different skill set that's required for that. And
yeah,
how would you help people navigate and think about where they'd want to ultimately end up in real estate? Yeah.
Well, for me, I think the toughest thing to comprehend as a young professional out of college is really, when you say, I want to do real estate, how many different real estate jobs there are, right? From investment sales broker to people who focus on leasing, working for a GP or an LP, or, which sector you want to work with. Do you like multifamily or hotel or retail? It's all so different, right? I think that my advice would be just to understand the paths, and again, you hear some people say, I've always wanted to be in multifamily since I was 13. I don't operate that way. I don't know. I mean, maybe you did always want to be real estate.
I didn't know what real estate was when I graduated, and it was through an alumni connection. Paul Massey, who's also been on this podcast, had founded Massey Knackle, and I just had a great feeling about the place. Now, I mean, is that different today? I mean, I see the resumes today. Candidates are so much more qualified. They've specialized. They've taken real estate classes. They've taken, they've got, these great internships. But no, I mean, but I think once you've landed, I mean, I would think, acquisitions would be, in many ways, it's kind of similar to what a broker does, where you're out there, you're trying to find opportunities. Of course, then you're negotiating them. Whereas I would imagine as an asset manager, you have to be pretty details oriented, right? To make sure and keep track. I mean, how many projects are you working on at a time, and how do you manage your schedule and your team?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I like about asset management is someone who's a little bit ADD and a little bit I like every day that's different. I mean, it's even when you're just working on a few properties, you don't know what's going to happen, right? Any day something could happen that's going to change the next 6 months of the investment, but you don't know. Most of the time it's negative, right? And you don't hope it happens, but there's different things that just keep coming up and keep you on your toes, right? So if someone's like, what's your day-to-day? It's well, I can look at my calendars and know that I have one-on-one check-ins with my team on an individual basis every week. I know that I need to talk to my investors every week. I know that I need to talk to, certain lenders at some period of times, but then I'm also dealing, since I'm in asset management, with internal issues with issues or just things that are happening with, accounting, if there's some legal, whether it's transactional or landlord tenant related, capital projects, looking at local laws in New York and getting prepared for those, which are coming down the pipeline. And it's just, the way that I've found, success is just by trying to stay organized, right? Because you're always going to have a laundry list of things. But I once took a organizational seminar where they kind of broke it down, and you have your immediate stuff, your midterm stuff, and your long-term stuff. And you keep your lists, right? And you want to get those lists as low down as possible. A lot of the stuff that you keep out there is stuff you don't want to do, right? So they're just move that to the immediate. Do I want to call someone and tell them they're not getting an assignment? No, I don't. But guess what? I have 5 minutes right now. I might as well do it. Checked off the list, right? So you just want to keep things going because, you also find by not moving things forward, a lot of the times you'll just end up in a worse position just farther down the road or in the same position further down the road. And you've just wasted time, right? And time is valuable. So, it's trying to just keep moving things along and getting different tasks to a place that you want it to get to. The acquisition side, which I really did enjoy. It's like, talking on the phone more, reaching out, having coffee, and then underwriting deals throughout the day. But then really at night, after working hours, I can't even imagine what it's like now, after COVID, but you need that time to underwrite your deals, right? You don't need to spend 5 hours looking at if a deal works or not. You can probably do that in 30 minutes if you need to, and you check it off and move to the road. So the thing that's interesting, acquisitions for me is you look at so many deals and the amount of deals that you buy is just a very small fraction of what your day-to-day is, right? So if you have a negative attitude, you could be like, I just worked for a month straight and didn't accomplish one thing. But in actuality, you do accomplish things because you're tightening your skill set. You're learning things to look at. You're looking at what works in deals, what doesn't work in deals. But the actual materiality of getting the investment into your portfolio, it happens very few and far between. Asset management, there's just always stuff going on. Stuff is always popping up. And, there is, a goal that you're always going to for certain assets, whether it's occupancy or reducing expenses, from a big portfolio, you're starting to look from a portfolio management standpoint. Okay, I want to cut all of, this line item across my 180 properties. Okay, well, that's a big project. And you got to start to talk to a lot of different people, get organized, figure out which properties need more help, and prioritize, right? Because we all have a limited amount of time. So it's really about kind of following the dollars, making big impacts, and then just doing your housekeeping when you have to. But you're totally right. They're completely different skill sets and experiences. You can have both skill sets and do both jobs, but they operate very differently.
That makes a ton of sense. So, Rob, as we started to wrap up, I'm thinking about, the idea of playing offense, meaning you've got a business plan and what you want to accomplish, but you're also getting thrown curveballs all the time where you're basically playing defense. So how do you reconcile that? How do you stay on plan with what you're looking to do when, these issues are coming up all the time?
Yeah. I think it's really just being disciplined to recognizing when you have that downtime and to continue your offensive plans. Like from an asset management standpoint, the amount of time that goes into just budgets and business plans every year is accessible, right? Or sorry, it takes a lot of time. So in between, October and January or February, that a lot of your time is going to be dedicated to that, right? So it's tough to, get on the offense because you're playing defense and you have these tasks that you need to complete. So after you get through that season, it's really saying, okay, listen, if we have a little downtime here, we got to go and do what we want to do. We need to look at our expenses. We need to start digging into, are we appealing all of our real estate tax assessments or that need to be appealed? Are we looking at different admin expenses, which properties are running higher than others? How can we do it? And we have to do it now because before you know it, something's going to happen at one of those properties and that's going to take your time. So you can't use the excuse of, I just don't have time. You need to identify when you have some of that downtime and really, hit the ground running.
Mm-hmm. And then lastly, advice that you would have for someone who's looking to get involved in affordable investing, whether it's, as a broker, as an operator, what advice would you tell that person? Is it, how do they, educate themselves to kind of learn the various programs? Do you start off working for a big shop, a small shop? What advice would you give somebody?
The one constant thing that I've kind of run across throughout my career is I always think getting as close to the operations will make you better in the long run. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people who I work with who either started in property management or very close to there because once you get down to the real day-to-day operations and you learn that stuff, you can start to pull up and pull back and start to then you can start to understand the playbook, the codes, the regulations, all of that good stuff. But really understand, and it's affordable or market, right? Learning the operations is very important. And that really is property management. So, I mean, and after doing that, I think that your asset management skills get better. I mean, if you're lucky enough to get in an acquisitions job, that's helpful. It makes you, everyone will always tell you, if you've worked in asset management and you're in acquisitions, it makes you a better acquisitions officer. If you've been in acquisitions and your asset management, it's going to make you better asset management. So I really think that understanding there's so much that goes into running properties, understanding every angle that you can and having a diverse background, I think has served me well. And I think it's served a lot of people that I work with quite well, in addition as again, at the end of the day, you're operating real estate. And then what happens after that, you can go in 1,000 different directions. But so the core component, that usually makes someone better at their day job.
Awesome. Well, Rob, this was really great. We really appreciate your sharing all the great work that you're doing at Fairstead, also your story and advice. So thanks again for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thanks as always for everyone who is listening. And as always, you can go and forward this episode to a friend or give it a rating. That's what helps spread the word. We're here to help you gain the insider's edge to real estate investing. You can find the show notes at jamesnelson.com. I built this site for you. That's how you can also find how to connect with Rob. So until next week, thank you again for joining.
This podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. The opinions expressed are those of the guests and not their companies. Listeners should not act upon the information without first seeking appropriate advice from an accountant, lawyer, or other professional.
Thank you for listening to the Insider's Edge to Real Estate Investing. We appreciate your subscribing and sharing with your friends. If you haven't already, please connect with James at James Nelson NYC on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. Please also visit jamesnelson.com, where you can find the show notes and other episodes, along with an exclusive video series and other helpful resources, so you can gain the insider's edge to real estate investing. Until next week.